Tonight, we examine the case of a man who vanished mid-flight with $200,000, and was never found. The case of DB Cooper. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the buried evidence, the cold trail, and the one clue that changed everything slowly unfold. Opening meditation. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a case when it finally reaches its end. Not silence, exactly. More like the exhale after a very long breath held. The kind of quiet that comes when two small children, missing for nearly 2 years, are finally found safe. When the people who love them can stop waiting by their phones. When the word alive gets to be the word that matters most. Tonight, we are going to sit with a story that began in Sacramento, California, on a warm July evening in 2024. A story that passed through grief, and confusion, and an international search spanning 2 countries and dozens of agencies. A story that, for a long time, offered very few answers, and then, slowly, began to offer a few more. This is not a story that ends in tragedy. That matters. And that rarity is worth acknowledging before we begin. Because so many of the stories we sit with at night do not turn out this way. So many searches do not end with the word recovered. So many families do not get to hold their children again. But this one does. So we will move through it carefully. We will look at every detail. We will follow the investigators across borders, through months of silence, through the slow and painstaking work of a multinational recovery operation. And at the end, we will arrive at a small town on the coast of Baja California, where 2 very young children were waiting to be found. Let's begin. Part 1, The Woman in the Bathtub. There is a question that investigators carry into every scene before they know what they are looking at. It is a simple question, almost elementary, but it shapes everything that comes after. The question is this: does this look like what it appears to be? On the evening of July 8, 2024, at just before 7:30 in the evening, a medical call went out from a residence on the 700 block of Didcot Circle in Sacramento, California. The call, depending on which account you read, was classified either as a domestic violence incident or as a request to investigate a possible deceased person. Those 2 classifications together, domestic violence, possible death, carry a particular weight. They suggest something more than an accident. They suggest that someone, somewhere, already suspected that what had happened in that apartment was not simply a medical emergency. Sacramento Fire Service arrived and made their way inside. What they found was a 28-year-old woman named Angelica Marie Bravo. She was unresponsive in the bathtub. Despite the efforts of first responders, she was pronounced dead at the scene. In the immediate aftermath of any unexplained death, investigators begin gathering information in concentric circles. The innermost circle is the scene itself, the body, the physical space, the details that refuse to arrange themselves into a tidy explanation. The next circle is the person. Who was she? Who were the people close to her? What was the shape of her daily life? What investigators learned about Angelica Bravo was this. She was 28 years old. She was a mother. She had 2 young children, a daughter named Athena, who was 4 years old, and a son named Mateo, who was 2. And she had recently done something that takes a particular kind of courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself as courage in the moment but very often turns out to be. She had left. Angelica had recently moved out of a shared living situation and into her own apartment. The apartment on Didcot Circle was hers, a space she had chosen, a space where she was building something separate. She had moved there with her children. She was trying to create distance between herself and a relationship that had been described, by those who knew the situation, as tumultuous. A relationship that had, at various points, involved accusations of domestic violence directed at her. The father of her children was a 38-year-old man. We will refer to him throughout this episode as Cameron. He had a prior history with law enforcement, including drug-related charges, with details that suggested his involvement went beyond simple possession. He and Angelica had a complicated and, by most accounts, difficult relationship. Even after the separation, even after Angelica had moved into her own space, Cameron still came around. He came to see his children. He still had a presence in the apartment, in the children's lives, in Angelica's world, even as she was trying to create distance. That detail, the continued presence, is one that investigators would return to again and again in the days that followed. Because when fire service arrived at that apartment on the evening of July 8, Angelica's children were not there. Athena and Matteo were gone. The absence of children from a home where a young mother has just been found dead is not something investigators can set aside. It becomes the immediate secondary concern, running parallel to the question of how Angelica died. Where were the children? Who had them? When had they last been seen? Investigators began the work of answering those questions. And almost immediately, the name Cameron came up. He was the father. He sometimes had the children. He would have had both access and a reason to be at the apartment. Investigators tried to contact him. They were not able to reach him. That inability to reach someone is, in itself, a piece of information. Not conclusive. Not, on its own, evidence of anything. People miss calls. People are unreachable for perfectly ordinary reasons. But in the context of a dead woman and two missing children, an absent and unreachable father reads differently. It becomes a thread worth pulling. Meanwhile, the official cause and manner of Angelica's death remained, at least initially, listed as inconclusive. That word, inconclusive, is one that investigators use carefully, because it keeps options open. It means the medical examiner has not yet been able to determine exactly what happened, and it means the investigation cannot yet classify the death as accident, natural causes, or homicide. It means everything remains possible, and nothing is yet settled. For the people who loved Angelica Bravo, the word inconclusive was not a comfort. It was a suspended state, a limbo from which the truth had not yet emerged. Her children were missing. The man who was the father of those children could not be found. And the woman herself was gone, the cause of her death not yet known. Sacramento investigators began making inquiries. They issued a lookout for Cameron. They began the process of tracing his movements. And then, within a short period of time, they discovered something that shifted the entire shape of the investigation. A vehicle had crossed the border. Part 2, the gray Honda Pilot. Not every piece of evidence announces itself clearly. Some of the most significant details in an investigation arrive quietly, almost bureaucratically: a database entry, a license plate record, a border crossing log. These systems exist precisely because they do the work of remembering when human witnesses cannot. They do not forget, do not misremember, do not have reasons to shade the truth. The vehicle belonging to Cameron, a gray 2023 Honda Pilot, bearing the California license plate 9JUS091, was one such piece of evidence. The vehicle had crossed into Mexico. Investigators established this through border crossing records, the kind of automated documentation that captures every vehicle passing through an official port of entry. The crossing had taken place on July 10, 2024. That was 2 days after Angelica Bravo was found unresponsive in her apartment. 2 days after her children were discovered to be missing. There is a particular significance to that 2-day window. It suggests planning. Not necessarily long-range, elaborate planning, but enough. Enough time to move, to gather what was needed, to cross a border before any formal alert could close that path. The border crossing records showed the vehicle entering Mexico on July 10. Investigators now had a direction, if not yet a destination. One additional detail about the vehicle itself is worth examining carefully. The gray Honda Pilot was not owned outright by Cameron. It had been loaned from a dealership. This is a detail that, on the surface, might seem incidental. People drive dealership loaners for all kinds of ordinary reasons. But in the context of a flight across an international border, it takes on a different texture. A vehicle that is not your own is a vehicle that is harder to track through ownership records. It is a vehicle that belongs, on paper, to someone else. Whether or not this was a deliberate calculation is not something investigators could determine immediately. But the detail was noted. 9 days after the border crossing was recorded, on July 19, 2024, investigators received another piece of information from across the border. The gray Honda Pilot had been located. It was found in the city of Ensenada, in the Baja California state of Mexico. Ensenada is a coastal city, roughly 80 miles south of the U.S.-Mexico border. It is a city that many Americans know, at least by name, as a popular destination for day trips and cruise ship stopovers. It has restaurants, a waterfront, a tourist economy. It also has, like any city of its size, neighborhoods and edges that exist well outside the tourist experience. The vehicle was found unoccupied. There was no sign of Cameron, no sign of the children. The car had been left, parked or abandoned, depending on how you interpret the act, and whoever had been inside it had moved on by other means, or by foot, or in ways that left no immediate record. An unoccupied vehicle at the end of a known travel route is a significant data point, but it is also, in some respects, a dead end. It tells investigators where someone was. It does not tell them where someone went. Ensenada is a city with connections, road connections heading further south down the Baja California Peninsula, as well as connections to smaller communities along the coast and inland. From Ensenada, a person could go in many directions. They could blend into a community. They could continue moving. They could stop. Investigators understood that the trail, at least the vehicular trail, had ended in Ensenada. Whatever came next would require different methods. Different sources of information. Human intelligence, community cooperation, the slow and painstaking work of building a picture of where a person might be hiding in a country that, for all its proximity to California, contains enormous stretches of geography where a person can become very difficult to find. But in those first weeks after the vehicle was found abandoned in Ensenada, that information had not yet arrived. The children remained missing. Their father remained at large. And the question of what exactly had happened to their mother on the evening of July 8 was still waiting for an answer that the medical examiner had not yet been able to provide. Investigators on both sides of the border were working. The search was active. But active searches can also be quiet searches, methodical, unglamorous, made up of phone calls and database queries and interviews and dead ends. For the people waiting at home, the family, the friends, the grandmother who would one day get to hold those children again, the quiet of those weeks must have been its own particular kind of wait. We do not know, from the public record, exactly what leads were followed in the months between the vehicle's discovery in July 2024 and the recovery operation that would eventually take place. What we know is that the investigation did not stop. And we know that somewhere in that long stretch of time, something shifted. A tip came in. Someone saw something. Someone knew something. And they made the decision to say so. Part 3, Who was Angelica? Before we follow the investigation further south, it is worth pausing here. Pausing to think about who Angelica Bravo was, not as a victim in a case file, not as a data point in a timeline, but as a person who had a life, who was building something, who was 28 years old and making choices that, in retrospect, look like survival. We know relatively little about Angelica from the public record of this case. What we know, we have to work with carefully, because the details that emerge from law enforcement sources and news coverage tend to orbit the event of her death rather than the substance of her living. But the outline of her is there, if you look. She was a young mother, 28 years old. Her daughter Athena was 4. Her son Mateo was 2. By any measure, she was in a phase of life defined almost entirely by the work of raising very young children, the particular exhaustion and tenderness of it, the way small children consume and give back in equal and overwhelming measure. That is not a backdrop. That is the foreground of a person's existence when their children are that age. She had been in a relationship with Cameron, a man 10 years older than her. The relationship was described, by those familiar with the situation, as tumultuous. Accusations of domestic violence had been made. These are the kinds of details that appear in case summaries as single sentences, but each one of those sentences represents something much longer, a pattern of experience, a set of decisions made under conditions of fear and constraint and complicated love, a life that did not arrange itself into simple categories. What stands out, and what deserves to be said clearly, is that Angelica had made the decision to leave. She had moved out. She had established her own apartment. She was, in the language of those who study domestic violence, in the process of separation, which is, statistically and historically, one of the most dangerous phases of an abusive relationship. The moment of leaving, or the period immediately after, is when violence escalates most sharply. The data on this is consistent and sobering. She was trying to build something separate. A home for herself and her children. A life at a distance from a relationship that had not been safe. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing, done under conditions of real risk, with two very young children depending on the outcome. On the evening of July 8, 2024, she was found in her own bathtub, unresponsive. The manner and cause of her death were initially listed as inconclusive. In the weeks and months that followed, as the investigation expanded, the charge of murder would eventually be filed against Cameron in connection with her death. That charge is an allegation, subject to the legal process. But it gives shape to what investigators came to believe had happened in that apartment. It is worth sitting with the sequence of events for a moment. Angelica moved out. She established her own home. Cameron still had access, he still came to see the children. And then, on the evening of July 8, she was found dead. Her children were gone. Their father was gone. His vehicle crossed into Mexico 2 days later. Each of those facts, taken alone, permits multiple interpretations. Taken together, they form a narrative that investigators clearly found compelling enough to pursue across international borders, through months of work, through an operation involving the resources of two governments. What we can say is that Angelica's children are alive. That they are with their maternal grandmother. That the family she was building, imperfect, complicated, interrupted, has not been entirely lost. The thread that connects those children to their mother's family has held. And that holding is, in part, a tribute to the woman who chose to leave, who chose to try, even when trying was dangerous. In true crime, we sometimes fall into the pattern of centering the investigation at the expense of the person. The detective work becomes the story. The methodology becomes the focus. This can be valuable, understanding how investigations work matters, but it can also crowd out the most important fact, which is that a real person lived and was loved and is now gone. Angelica Bravo was 28 years old. She was a mother. She was trying to build a safer life for herself and her children. And she deserves to be remembered as more than a detail in a timeline. With that, let us return to the investigation, the long, slow, multinational work of finding out what happened, and of finding the children she left behind. Part 4, The Man Called Major. Every investigation eventually arrives at the question of who. Not just who was present, not just who had opportunity, but who is this person, in the fullest sense of that word. What does their history look like? What patterns run through their choices? What does the shape of their life, examined carefully, tell us about the shape of the events we are trying to understand? Cameron, known, according to accounts of the case, by the street name Major, was 38 years old at the time of Angelica's death. A decade older than she was. He had a prior record that included drug-related charges, and the nature of those charges suggested, to investigators familiar with the case, that his involvement in the drug trade went beyond personal use. The details are not fully specified in the public record, but the framing, drug charges consistent with distribution or dealing, paints a particular picture of how he had been operating in the world. He was the father of Athena and Matteo. Whatever his relationship with Angelica had become, and whatever accusations had been made in that relationship, his connection to those two children was real and ongoing. He came to the apartment. He spent time with them. He was present in their lives even after the separation. The street name, Major, is an interesting detail, though we should be careful not to read too much into it. Street names and nicknames tell us something about how a person presents themselves or how others see them, but they are not character analyses. What they sometimes reflect is a kind of self-narrative, the story a person tells about who they are, or who they want to be seen as. What we know about Cameron's actions in the immediate aftermath of Angelica's death tells us more. 2 days after she was found in her apartment, his vehicle crossed into Mexico. He did not wait for contact from investigators. He did not reach out to explain his whereabouts. He did not, as far as the public record indicates, make any voluntary contact with law enforcement in the days following the discovery of Athena and Mateo's mother. He moved. He crossed a border. He took his children with him. The decision to cross into Mexico with 2 very young children, children who were not his alone, children whose mother had just died under circumstances that law enforcement was actively investigating, is a decision that requires examination. On one level, it is simply flight. A person who believes, correctly or incorrectly, that they are about to be suspected of something serious, making the instinctive calculation to put distance between themselves and the investigation. But Cameron did not go alone. He took a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And he remained in Mexico, with those children, for nearly 2 years. What that period looked like from the inside, from the perspective of the children, from the perspective of Cameron himself, we can only speculate about, at least from what is available in the public record. Did he establish some version of a normal daily routine? Did he move around, changing locations, avoiding patterns that might make him identifiable? Did he believe, eventually, that the search had wound down? Did he think he had succeeded? These are questions that the investigation, and eventually the legal process, will begin to answer. What we know is that for nearly 2 years, Cameron managed to remain out of reach. That is not an easy thing to do with 2 young children in tow. Children are conspicuous. They require food, and medical attention, and care. They talk. They play. They exist in the world in ways that adults trying to stay hidden cannot always control. The assault weapon charges that were filed alongside the murder charge suggest something about the resources Cameron may have had access to during the period before and after the border crossing. For counts of possession of an assault weapon is a specific and significant charge. It speaks to a level of armament that goes well beyond ordinary self-defense. It connects, at least in legal terms, to the broader profile of a man who had prior drug-related charges suggesting distribution. None of this is a verdict. It is important to say that clearly. The charges against Cameron are allegations. They will be tested in court. The legal process exists precisely to determine what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and that process has not yet run its course. But for the purposes of understanding this investigation, understanding why it unfolded the way it did, why it required the resources of 2 governments and multiple agencies, why it took nearly 2 years, the profile of Cameron matters. Investigators were not looking for someone who had made an impulsive and easily reversible decision. They were looking for someone who appeared to have planned, who had resources, who had made it across a border before an alert could stop him, and who had, for a very long time, managed to stay gone. That kind of search requires patience, and methodology, and the kind of sustained institutional attention that is difficult to maintain over months and years when other cases are always arriving, always demanding resources. That the investigation was sustained, that the agencies involved kept working, that the tip that eventually broke the case was received and acted upon, these are the things that made the difference. We will return to Cameron when we arrive at the recovery operation. But first, we need to understand the geography he chose. Because Baja California is not an accidental destination. And where you hide, and how you choose to hide, tells its own story. Part 5, Baja California. Baja California is a long, narrow peninsula that stretches roughly 700 miles south from the U.S. border into the Pacific. It is one of those places that most Americans know primarily as a framing device, a beach town, a drive, a cruise stop, a place you visit for a weekend and return from with a sunburn and a pleasant memory. But Baja California is also a real and complex place, with its own communities, its own geography, its own rhythms of daily life that exist entirely separately from the tourist experience. Ensenada, where Cameron's vehicle was found abandoned on July 19, 2024, is the third largest city in Baja California. It sits on a bay, roughly a 2-hour drive from the U.S. border. It has a population of several 100,000 people. It has a port, a wine country nearby, universities, markets, neighborhoods that stretch up into the hills away from the waterfront. It is not a remote place. It is a city where someone arriving from California might, on the surface, not look dramatically out of place. But Cameron did not stay in Ensenada. At least, that is what the eventual recovery suggests. When investigators finally located the children, they were not found in Ensenada. They were found in Primo Tapia. Primo Tapia is a small coastal community, located roughly 45 miles north of Ensenada, closer to the border than Ensenada is. It sits along the coast of the Pacific, in the El Sauzal and Primo Tapia area of Baja California. It is a much quieter place than Ensenada, a smaller community, the kind of place where a person can establish a degree of local invisibility that a larger city does not always permit. There are communities along that stretch of coast that have significant populations of Americans who have chosen to live in Mexico, for a variety of reasons, over the years. The presence of English speakers, of people who are not visibly part of a particular local community, can sometimes be less remarkable in such places than it might be elsewhere. Whether Cameron was living openly or in concealment in Primo Tapia, whether he had established some kind of local presence or was actively trying to remain invisible, is not something the public record makes entirely clear. What we know is that he was there, or near there, with the children, for some period of time. And that a tip, a piece of information from a member of the public, ultimately directed investigators to that location. The geography of Baja California matters to this investigation for another reason. It is, in certain stretches, a place where law enforcement presence varies significantly from area to area. The northern parts of the state, close to the border, have a level of institutional attention that comes from proximity to U.S.-Mexico border operations. The further south you go, the more the geography changes, the more the population thins out, the more the physical landscape, mountains, desert, coastline, creates natural isolation. Primo Tapia, sitting roughly 45 miles south of the border, is not the deep south of the peninsula. It is not so remote that it falls off the map of institutional attention. But it is small enough, and quiet enough, that the presence of an American man with 2 young children might simply have appeared, to neighbors or passers-by, as an ordinary family situation. A father with his kids. Nothing remarkable. Nothing to report. Until someone decided it was worth reporting. We will come to that tip in the appropriate sequence. But first, it is worth thinking about what nearly 2 years in a foreign country looks like for 2 very young children. Athena was 4 when they left California. She was 5 when she was recovered. Matteo was 2 when they left. He was 4 when he was found. Those are enormous years in a child's development. Those are the years when language solidifies, when the world begins to make more sense, when friendships start to form, when memory begins to hold on to things in a way it couldn't before. Where the children went to school, if they went to school. What language they were speaking by the time they were found. What they understood about their situation, what they had been told about their mother, what they knew or did not know about the life they had left behind. These are questions that child welfare specialists and mental health professionals would be working to understand in the weeks and months after their recovery. They are questions that will take time to answer, and that will shape the kind of support these children need going forward. Baja California, for all its beauty and complexity as a place, becomes, in this story, a landscape of concealment. A place where a man took 2 small children and waited. And where, eventually, he was found. Part 6, The Architecture of a Search. Most people, when they think about a missing persons search, imagine something immediate: teams of people moving through fields, helicopters overhead, news cameras at press conferences. That image is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. The kinds of searches that cross international borders, that last months and years rather than days, look very different. They are quieter. They are more methodical. They involve entirely different kinds of work. The search for Athena and Matteo Lee, and for their father, was, by the time it concluded, the product of coordination between an extraordinary number of agencies. Mexico's Attorney General's Office. U.S. immigration officials. Elements of the Mexican military. The FBI Legal Attaché Office in Mexico City. The U.S. Consulate General in Tijuana. U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The U.S. Department of Justice Office of International Affairs. That list is not incidental. It represents months of formal coordination, legal agreements, shared information, and the careful navigation of jurisdictional boundaries between 2 sovereign nations. When a case involves children, that commitment is often easier to maintain. There is something about the combination of youth and absence, the image of a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old somewhere unknown, that holds attention in a way that other cases sometimes do not. Child abduction cases, particularly international ones, tend to receive sustained institutional focus in ways that reflect both policy priorities and human instinct. But sustained focus alone does not produce results. What produces results is information. And the most important source of information in a case like this is almost always the same: people who know something, and who decide to say so. Public tips in missing persons cases range enormously in quality and usefulness. Most tips do not lead directly to anything. Most tips require follow-up, verification, cross-referencing with other information, before they can be assessed. The work of processing tips is itself a kind of investigation, separating the signal from the noise, identifying which pieces of information can be corroborated, which details are specific enough to act on. What we know about the tip that broke this case is limited by what has been made public. We know that a public tip was identified as a key factor in the eventual recovery and arrest operation. We know that the campaign that led to the operation lasted approximately 6 months before the May 2026 conclusion. That suggests that the tip, or some critical piece of information, arrived approximately around November or December of 2025, and that from that point, investigators spent roughly 6 months building the case for an operation that was specific enough, and coordinated enough, to bring in all those agencies simultaneously. 6 months between receiving critical information and executing an operation might seem like a long time. But in international law enforcement coordination, it is not unusual. A tip is not a warrant. A tip is not a legal basis for a cross-border arrest. Turning a tip into actionable intelligence, verifying the information, determining exact locations, coordinating the legal mechanisms for an international arrest, ensuring that the operation can be conducted safely and that the children will not be harmed, all of that takes time. It takes careful, unglamorous, institutional time. There is also the question of what recovery means when you are talking about 2 young children who have been living with their father for nearly 2 years. This is not a question with a simple answer. The physical act of finding the children and bringing them to safety is one thing. The legal framework governing their return, who has custody, under what authority can U.S. investigators operate on Mexican soil, what happens to Cameron simultaneously, is a much more complex set of questions, requiring coordination between legal systems in 2 countries. The involvement of Mexico's Attorney General's office, the Mexican military, immigration officials, and U.S. legal attaches reflects exactly this complexity. An operation of this kind must be agreed upon by Mexican authorities, because it is taking place on Mexican soil. Mexican law governs what can and cannot happen on Mexican territory. The coordination is not simply logistical, it is legal, it is diplomatic, it is institutional in the deepest sense. That all of this came together, and came together successfully, is a tribute to the sustained effort of a large number of people working across 2 countries, in 2 languages, within 2 legal systems, toward a single goal. Finding those children. Bringing them home. Part 7, The Tip That Changed Everything. There is a particular courage in deciding to say something. To pick up the phone, or send an email, or walk into a police station, and say, I think I know something. I think I have seen something. I am not entirely sure, but I believe it might matter. That act, the act of a private person deciding to pass on information, is one of the most consequential and underappreciated acts in the history of criminal investigation. Grand jury indictments, forensic evidence, surveillance operations, all of these matter. But again and again, in case after case, the single most important factor in a resolution turns out to be a person who knew something and said so. We do not know, from what has been made public, who made the tip in this case. We do not know what they saw, exactly, or how they connected what they saw to the missing children case. We do not know if they had seen news coverage, or a social media post, or a flyer, or if they had simply encountered Cameron and the children in some ordinary context and something had not sat right with them. We do not know if they made the call immediately or if they sat with it for a while first, weighing the decision. What we know is that they made it. And that their decision changed the outcome. The public tip, as described in available reporting, was a key factor in the initiation of the recovery campaign that ultimately led to the children being found in Primo Tapia, Baja California. The campaign lasted approximately 6 months. 6 months of verification, of coordination, of building the legal and logistical framework necessary to act on what that tip had provided. Think about what those 6 months required. Investigators needed to confirm that the information in the tip was accurate, that the location was real, that the children were there, that Cameron was with them. This could not be done casually, not with the complexity of a cross-border operation. Every detail needed to be checked. Every piece of corroborating information needed to be assembled. They needed to coordinate with Mexican authorities in a way that was formal enough to produce a legal operation, but careful enough not to alert Cameron. The risk of any complex operation involving multiple agencies is that information moves through many hands, and the more hands it moves through, the higher the possibility of a premature alert. That risk had to be managed, had to be controlled, had to be planned around. They needed to ensure that when the operation went in, it went in with enough resources and enough precision to secure Cameron without putting the children in danger. 2 small children in close proximity to an arrest situation, and potentially in proximity to a man who was, at that point, facing murder charges and who was alleged to be in possession of assault weapons, required careful tactical planning. The safety of the children had to be the paramount concern. All of that planning, all of that coordination, all of that careful and unglamorous institutional work, came together on May 17, 2026. On that day, in the small coastal community of Primo Tapia, Baja California, Mexico, Athena and Mateo Lee were found alive. Athena was 5 years old. Mateo was 4. They were safely recovered. Cameron was arrested. The simplicity of that sentence, "they were found alive," does not capture what it cost to produce it. It does not capture the months of waiting. The tips processed and discarded. The legal frameworks assembled and coordinated. The agencies brought into alignment. The careful planning of an operation that could not afford to go wrong. But it is the right sentence. The most important sentence. They were found alive. Part 8, The Recovery Operation. The operation itself, the physical act of recovering the children and arresting Cameron, was the culmination of an extended multinational effort. What we know about the specifics is limited by what has been officially disclosed, but the shape of the operation can be understood from the agencies involved and the outcome achieved. Operations of this kind, executed on Mexican soil with the coordination of Mexican federal authorities, do not resemble a television arrest scene. They are planned in detail. They involve multiple teams, assigned to multiple objectives, executing simultaneously or in careful sequence. In this case, the objectives were, at minimum, locating and securing Cameron, recovering the children safely, and ensuring that no one, including Cameron, was in a position to prevent or complicate the recovery. The involvement of elements of the Mexican military in an operation like this is significant. The Mexican military is periodically deployed in support of law enforcement operations in Mexico, particularly in cases involving serious organized crime or, as here, high-profile fugitive situations with an international dimension. Their participation reflects the seriousness with which the Mexican government treated this case, and the level of coordination that had been achieved between U.S. and Mexican authorities over the 6 months of the operation. The FBI Legal Attaché Office in Mexico City plays a specific role in U.S.-Mexico law enforcement coordination. Legal attaches, sometimes referred to as legats, are FBI agents stationed in U.S. embassies and consulates around the world, specifically tasked with building and maintaining relationships with foreign law enforcement agencies and facilitating cooperation in cases with international dimensions. They are, in a sense, the human infrastructure through which U.S. investigations in foreign countries become possible. Their involvement in this case reflects exactly the kind of sustained, relationship-based cooperation that makes an operation like this achievable. The U.S. Consulate General in Tijuana, similarly, serves as a point of coordination between U.S. and Mexican government functions in the northern Baja California region. Tijuana, just south of the U.S. border, is the largest city in Baja California and the hub of U.S. consular activity in the region. The consulate's involvement would have included both the diplomatic and the practical, helping to navigate the legal requirements for U.S. citizens found on Mexican soil, helping to coordinate the logistics of the children's return to the United States. The U.S. Department of Justice Office of International Affairs is, perhaps, the least familiar of the agencies listed to a general audience, but it is no less important. The Office of International Affairs, often referred to as OIA, handles the legal mechanics of international law enforcement cooperation, extradition requests, mutual legal assistance, the formal legal instruments that allow one country to support another's criminal investigation. Without OIA's involvement, the legal basis for an arrest in Mexico and the subsequent return of a U.S. citizen to face charges in the United States would be far more complicated. U.S. Customs and Border Protection was also involved, reflecting the border dimension of the case, the fact that the crime had begun in California, that the initial flight had crossed through an official port of entry, and that the eventual return of the children would itself require passage through a port of entry. All of these agencies, working in concert, over 6 months, executing on a plan built from a public tip and sustained by the institutional commitment of investigators who had refused to let the case go cold. When the operation concluded on May 17, 2026, the children were immediately taken into protective care. In situations involving children who have been in an unconventional or potentially harmful living situation for an extended period, the immediate priority is their physical safety and well-being. Medical evaluation. Assessment of their condition. A safe handoff to appropriate caregivers. In this case, that handoff went to family. Athena and Mateo were placed in the care of their maternal grandmother, their mother Angelica's mother, in California. That detail carries a particular weight. The children would be returning to family that connects them to their mother. To a grandmother who, we can only imagine, had spent nearly 2 years not knowing where her grandchildren were, whether they were safe, whether she would ever see them again. The return of those 2 children to that grandmother is not a footnote. It is, in many ways, the most human moment in a story that had, for a long time, been defined by absence. Part 9, The Charges. Cameron was arrested on May 17, 2026, in connection with the recovery operation. He was charged with murder, in connection with the death of Angelica Bravo in July 2024, and with 4 counts of possession of an assault weapon. It is worth taking a moment to examine what these charges tell us, and what they do not tell us. The murder charge reflects what investigators had, by this point, concluded about what happened in Angelica's apartment on the evening of July 8, 2024. The initial classification of her death as inconclusive was not a permanent finding. It was a placeholder, used while the medical examiner and investigators gathered more information. Over the months that followed, as the investigation developed, the understanding of what had happened in that apartment apparently evolved to the point where prosecutors were prepared to file a murder charge. We do not know, from the public record, what specific evidence supports the murder charge. The official cause and manner of death, what the medical examiner ultimately concluded after the initial inconclusive determination, has not been detailed in what has been publicly disclosed about this case. This is not unusual in active prosecutions. Detailed evidentiary information is often withheld until trial, to preserve the integrity of the proceedings. What we can note is the pattern of facts that were known before any charge was filed. Angelica was found dead in her apartment under circumstances described as inconclusive. She had recently left a relationship characterized by domestic violence. The father of her children could not be contacted. He crossed an international border 2 days later with those children. He remained in Mexico, out of reach, for nearly 2 years. That pattern does not constitute proof of a crime. Only the legal process can establish proof. But it is the kind of pattern that investigators and prosecutors find meaningful. It is the kind of pattern that, combined with whatever forensic and evidentiary findings were developed over the course of the investigation, was sufficient to support a murder charge. The 4 counts of possession of an assault weapon are a separate matter, legally speaking, though they connect to the broader profile of Cameron's activities. 4 counts, not 1, not 2, suggests multiple weapons. The specificity of the charge reflects either weapons that were found at the time of the arrest, or weapons that were documented and traceable to Cameron through prior investigation. The assault weapon charges connect, potentially, to the prior drug-related history. They add dimension to the picture of who this person was and what resources he had access to. As of the time of the recovery in May 2026, Cameron is in custody and facing these charges. The legal process, arraignment, discovery, preliminary hearings, potentially a trial, will unfold in the months and years ahead. What that process will ultimately determine, what evidence will be presented and contested, what verdict will eventually be returned, none of that is yet known. What is known is that the children are safe. That their grandmother has them. That the investigation that began on a July evening in Sacramento has reached, if not its final conclusion, at least the point where the most urgent question, where are the children, has been answered. There is still a legal process ahead. There is still the question of what happened in that apartment, to be tested and argued in a courtroom. There is still the long work of helping 2 very young children process an experience that no child should have. None of that is simple. None of that is quick. But the children are alive. And they are home. Part 10, What Nearly 2 Years Means. When we talk about a 22-month disappearance in a case like this, it is easy to speak in the abstract. 22 months. Nearly 2 years. The numbers are clear, the timeline is measurable. But what does 22 months actually mean, in the lived experience of the people involved? For Athena and Matteo, it means their entire frame of reference shifted. Matteo, who was 2 years old when he left Sacramento, is now 4. He has almost no memory, or a very different kind of memory, of California. His first coherent memories of the world around him were formed, at least in part, in Mexico. His earliest language experiences, his earliest sense of what daily life looks like, all of that was shaped by a geography and a context very different from the one his mother had built for him. Athena, for when she left, has more of a foundation to draw from. At 4, children have built enough experience to retain some memory of what came before. She may remember her mother. She may remember the apartment on Didcot Circle, or the routines that defined their lives in Sacramento. But those memories would have been living alongside a completely different present, for 22 months. The way children process that kind of discontinuity, the way they make meaning of it, or cannot yet make meaning of it, is something that child psychologists and therapists are trained to help with. For their maternal grandmother, 22 months means something entirely different. It means 2 years of not knowing. 2 years of imagining, of forcing yourself not to imagine, what might be happening to children you love. 2 years of living alongside grief that had no clear object, because the grief for Angelica was already enormous, and the uncertainty about the children was its own separate wound. Not knowing is its own particular kind of suffering. It is the suffering of a door left open, of a story left unresolved, of love with nowhere to land. And then, on May 17, 2026, the door closed. Not cleanly. Closed doors in situations like this are rarely clean. But it closed. The children were found. They were safe. They were coming home. For investigators and the agencies involved, 22 months represents something else again. It represents the sustained institutional commitment to a case that had no obvious, quick resolution. It represents the continued allocation of resources and attention to a search that did not produce results quickly, that required building and maintaining cooperation across borders and agencies for an extended period of time. It represents every person who worked this case over those 22 months who had to keep believing that the search was worth continuing. International missing children cases are difficult in ways that domestic cases are not. Jurisdiction is complicated. Information sharing between different national systems is imperfect. The legal frameworks for cross-border cooperation, while they exist and function, are never as smooth in practice as they are in principle. The fact that this case was resolved, that all the coordination actually worked, is not something to be taken for granted. It also reflects, to some degree, the particular attention that child abduction cases receive relative to other missing persons cases. Not because the other cases matter less, every missing person matters, but because children, and particularly very young children, represent a category of vulnerability that tends to activate institutional resources in specific ways. The agencies that came together for this operation did so in part because their mandates include exactly this kind of case, and because the public visibility of a child abduction sustained the political and institutional will to keep resources assigned to it. For the person who made the tip, whose name and details are not a matter of public record, 22 months has a different shape again. They know something that almost no one else knows, that their decision to say something was the thing that changed the outcome. That without their call, or email, or whatever form their information took, the operation might not have happened when it did. Or at all. That is a remarkable thing to carry. Part 11, What the Case Tells Us. Cases like this one do not exist in isolation. They sit inside larger patterns of domestic violence, of international fugitive situations, of the challenges of cross-border law enforcement cooperation. And those patterns are worth examining, not because they make any individual case less specific or less painful, but because understanding the patterns is part of how things change. Angelica Bravo was trying to leave a situation that had been characterized by domestic violence. She had done the thing that advocates and professionals recommend. She had physically removed herself from the shared household. She had established her own space. She was in the process of creating distance. And yet the situation followed her, in the way that these situations so often do, because leaving a physical space does not immediately sever the connections that make a dangerous situation dangerous. This is one of the most important and most difficult things to understand about domestic violence, that the act of leaving does not, by itself, produce safety. The period following separation is often the period of highest risk. Resources, safety planning, legal protections, and social support are all critical during this period, not as nice-to-haves, but as genuine determinants of whether someone survives it. In this case, Angelica did not survive. And her children were taken across an international border by the man accused of killing her. That sequence of events is a stark illustration of the way that domestic violence does not respect the boundaries of a separation, does not stop at the threshold of a new apartment, does not limit its damage to the direct relationship between two adults. On the international fugitive dimension, this case illustrates both the challenges and the possibilities of cross-border law enforcement cooperation. The challenges are real: jurisdiction, legal frameworks, information sharing, the sheer logistics of coordinating agencies in two countries. The nearly 2-year duration of the search reflects these challenges honestly. It was not quick. It was not simple. But the possibility is also real. The operation worked. The agencies cooperated. The tip was received, processed, and acted upon. The children were found alive. That outcome is not inevitable, it is the product of sustained commitment, effective coordination, and a measure of good fortune in the form of a person who decided to make a call. The public tip dimension of this case is also worth examining as a structural matter. Law enforcement agencies in the United States and Mexico regularly circulate information about missing persons and fugitives to the public, through press releases, social media, missing children databases, and media partnerships. The theory behind this circulation is straightforward: the more people who know what to look for, the higher the probability that someone will see it. The challenge is that this works inconsistently. Most circulated information reaches people who are not in a position to provide useful tips. But occasionally, the information reaches exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. In this case, it did. The tip that led to the recovery was described as a public tip, meaning it came from someone who was not part of the official investigation, not a source who had been cultivated by investigators, but a member of the public who came forward. That is the system working as intended. And it is a reminder that the role of ordinary people in law enforcement outcomes, while often invisible and rarely celebrated, is frequently decisive. The case also tells us something about the experience of children who are moved across borders by a fugitive parent. This is not a unique situation. International parental abduction, the taking of children across international borders by a parent, often in violation of custody orders or following a crime, is a recognized and documented phenomenon. It is addressed, in part, by the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, a treaty designed to create legal mechanisms for the return of children wrongfully removed from their country of habitual residence. The United States and Mexico are both signatories to this convention. In this case, the circumstances go well beyond a typical parental abduction, given the criminal charges involved. But the experience of the children, removed from their home country, placed in an unfamiliar environment, separated from their maternal family and from any connection to their deceased mother's world, shares important features with the experience documented in international parental abduction cases. Research on these cases suggests that the impact on children can be significant and long-lasting, particularly in terms of identity, attachment, and the complex feelings that arise from being used, in some sense, as part of an adult's crisis. Athena and Mateo will need support. That support, in the care of their grandmother and whatever professional resources are made available to them, will be one of the most important ongoing dimensions of this story, not as a matter of public record, but as a matter of private human healing. Part 12, The End of Waiting. On May 17, 2026, in the community of Primo Tapia, Baja California, Mexico, 2 children were recovered alive. Their names were Athena and Mateo Lee. They were 5 and 4 years old. The operation that produced their recovery was the result of 6 months of coordinated work by law enforcement and government agencies in 2 countries. It was initiated, at least in its final phase, by a public tip, a person who saw something, or knew something, and decided to say so. The father of the children was arrested at or near the time of the recovery. He now faces charges of murder and 4 counts of possession of an assault weapon. The children are in the care of their maternal grandmother in California. That sentence is the resolution. Not the satisfying, cinematic kind of resolution, where every question is answered and every wound is healed and the credits roll. Real resolutions are not like that. Real resolutions are partial, ongoing, complicated. They are points of arrival that are also points of beginning. The legal process is beginning. The children's healing is beginning. The grandmother's new reality, 2 grandchildren in her care, their mother gone, their lives forever marked by what happened, is beginning. But the waiting is over. The not knowing is over. The question of where they are has been answered, and the answer is, safe. Here. Home. For the investigators who worked this case, across Sacramento, across the border, across agencies and jurisdictions and 2 years of sustained effort, May 17, 2026 is the day the case turned from a search into an arrest. That is not the end of their work. The prosecution of Cameron will require testimony, evidence presentation, legal argument. There is still a long road through the justice system. But the children are safe. And that was always the most urgent objective. It is worth, at this ending, returning to the person who is absent from it. Angelica Marie Bravo was 28 years old. She was a mother who loved her children. She was a woman who was trying to leave a difficult situation, who who was building a new life in her own apartment, who was doing the brave and dangerous thing of trying to create safety for herself and for her children. She did not survive to see them recovered. She did not survive to hold them again, or to bring them home herself, or to tell them whatever she would have told them when this was over. Her mother, their grandmother, is the one who gets to do that now. And she carries Angelica with her in that work. The thread between those children and their mother is kept alive, in part, by the woman who raised Angelica, who now raises Angelica's children. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Wherever you are tonight, listening to this, we hope you are warm. We hope you are safe. We hope that if you ever know something that might matter, something that might help someone who is waiting, you will find the courage that one unnamed person found in this case. They made a call. And 2 children came home. Closing meditation. Some nights, the stories we carry into sleep are heavy ones. Stories of loss and searching, of borders crossed and time passing, of a young mother who deserved better and 2 small children who needed to be found. Tonight's story ends in the right place. Not without grief. There is grief here that will not be quick to resolve, grief for Angelica, for the years the children lost, for the family that will never be entirely whole again. But grief and good news can coexist. Loss and recovery can both be true at the same time. Athena is 5. Matteo is 4. They are with their grandmother. They are safe. The investigation that found them was patient and methodical and sustained by the quiet commitment of many people working across 2 countries. The tip that helped find them came from a person who made a simple decision to say what they knew. These are small and human things, in the end. Patience. Methodical work. The courage to speak. As you settle toward sleep tonight, let this story rest gently. Let the resolution hold. Let the image of those 2 children, found and safe and home, be the thing that travels with you into the quiet. Thank you for listening. We will be here when you return. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?